I'm here today with Professor Robert Lawrence, an internationally renowned trade and investment professor from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. And he's been in South Africa for a few days talking to us about Trump, trade, and trouble. So, Robert, can you tell us at the outset what is a tariff? How do
A tariff is basically a tax. It historically has been used by governments in order to raise money, um, and so it's levied when goods come into the country. More recently, since we now have things like the Internal Revenue Service to raise money, it's more commonly used to protect domestic industry by charging higher prices on imported goods. The domestic firms have an advantage.
I once heard you say that um, you think tariffs should all be assumed to be guilty and they must prove their innocence, their necessity for a country. Can you explain that comment?
Well, when you do impose a tariff, you impose costs. By protecting the domestic industry, you actually have your production being produced by producers who may be less efficient. You also deny consumers the ability to buy goods at lower prices. And so these are the major costs that are associated with raising money through tariffs. And that's why I think, in general, they are a very inefficient way to raise money, and I presume them guilty unless you have a very good reason to intervene in order to protect your domestic industry.
Doesn't that make domestic industry less competitive globally?
Well, uh, it can definitely do that. If, for instance, you put a tariff on imported cloth, it's going to be more expensive to produce shirts. And so your country will have more difficulty in exporting to the rest of the world. So you hurt your own competitiveness in addition to making consumers pay higher prices as a result of tariffs.
So, why is President Trump, head of one of the most powerful economies the world has ever seen, why is he introducing all these tariffs suddenly? What's going on?
Well, he has a number of reasons. One of those, and I think centrally motivating him, is an idea that America has been unfairly treated by the rest of the world because it has charged low tariffs on goods coming into the US, whereas other countries have tended to have higher tariffs and other trade barriers on American exports. So that's one motive. He has a second, which is, he thinks, if he does impose these tariffs and disadvantage those who are based outside the United States from trying to sell in the American market, he's going to encourage those firms to come and set up their factories in America. So he wants to make America a manufacturing powerhouse. There's a third reason, which is he wants to raise money. And if he imposes tariffs, he'll make the United States will increase its revenue, and therefore he'll be able to give tax cuts and devote the money to spending on other programs.
So, what impact do you think these tariffs will have on America? Let's start there.
Well, I think firstly, the initial impact of tariffs is to raise prices. And it's quite ironic because one of the reasons President Biden lost, the Biden administration wasn't able to get reelected, Kamala Harris lost the election, is that Americans were very angry that under Joseph Biden, prices had increased. And Donald Trump promised that he'd bring lower prices to America. But in fact, by imposing these tariffs, he's going to make all goods that are imported more expensive if they come into the United States. So that's the first effect. The second is that we live in a world in which very few goods are made in just one country. Goods tend to be made in the world. There are these thick global supply chains. And when you put a tariff in place, you interfere with the free flow of goods, and that's going to create shortages if you make it more difficult for producers to get the inputs they need to produce products. And so I would expect that a lot of firms are going to have trouble operating in the United States. And so that could lead to higher unemployment in the United States. And the U.S. could, in fact, have stagflation, something that they call stagflation. It means we would have higher prices on the one hand and less jobs on the other. Donald Trump says in the long run we'll get more jobs as these firms come and set up in the U.S., but, that's going to take a long time. So the program is being sold as short-term pain for long-term gain, but more realistically, the gains, if we do get them, are going to take 2 or 3 years to be apparent.
So what do you think this means for other countries? Let's start with China.
Well, America is a very big market for China, and already in the first Trump administration, there were negotiations because China's different economic system made many Americans feel that China was unfair, China was stealing American intellectual property, China's market itself wasn't very open, China wasn't using a market-based economic system, and therefore China needed, the playing field needed to be leveled by imposing tariffs on China. In the current episode, even higher tariffs are being imposed on China. It's being singled out, not only for its economic system, but for a failure to control the supply of fentanyl to the United States. A lot of different reasons are being invoked. But at the end of the day, really punitive tariffs are being imposed on China, on order of 50% sometimes, and perhaps they're going as high as 100.
What do you think of Canada's reaction to President Trump's tariffs and other things he's threatening that country?
Well, firstly, Donald Trump, under Donald Trump's leadership, the United States renewed a free trade agreement with Canada. So legally, the U.S. has committed itself not to have any tariffs at all between the United States and Canada. Donald Trump has gone back on America's word and is now imposing very high tariffs on Canada. And the U.S., Mexico, and Canada are all very deeply integrated. The supply chains have been established on the premise that there aren't any trade barriers. So automobile companies, for instance, will have some of their parts made in Canada, they will have other parts made in Mexico, and they'll assemble the cars in the United States. If you put a tariff at the border, you're going to interfere with the free flow of their operations. And Canada in particular is aggrieved. Some of the tariffs have been imposed on steel and aluminium in the name of national security. Canada is America's not only neighbor, but an ally in many wars, and to be singled out on the grounds of national security and as a threat to the United States is something which has deeply insulted the Canadians. They don't want to sing, they don't want to stand when the American anthem is played, when we have ice hockey games with the Canadians, and so there's a lot of friction between them. And the Canadians import something like 80% of their products from the United States and sell a huge amount of their exports, a huge share, to the U.S. And so this is going to be very, very damaging to to the Canadian economy. It's going to take them a long time to adjust if they're ever able to. And so they are going to be severely affected with the prospects of much higher unemployment.
What about the EU? Very big trading bloc. What are the consequences for the EU as a whole, or particular countries in the EU?
Well, so the EU faces at the moment a very difficult situation. The transatlantic trade and investment, some of the biggest volumes of trade and investment between two different economies in the world, and this is being impeded. Again, America had committed itself to certain low tariff levels under the rules of the World Trade Organization, and now these are being broken. The situation is more complicated for Europe because of the war in the Ukraine, and because NATO plays a major role, and America leads NATO in bolstering the Ukrainian efforts to try to defend themselves against the Russians. So on the one hand, the Europeans have to be careful that they don't alienate America too much, because they still need American military support. But at the same time, they want to stand up for their rights, and they have a lot of power in setting prices and affecting the U.S. market. And so they're going to retaliate by choosing areas where they feel the United States is most dependent on Europe.
Let me ask you about a very different country, Lesotho, South Africa's neighbor. Why are they getting such high tariffs?
Well, although the Trump administration presented the tariffs as a measure to try to restore reciprocity and make the playing field level, they used very questionable economic methods. And in particular, what they focused on is whether or not the country had a big trade surplus with the United States. Now, Lesotho had benefited and has benefited from the fact that Lesotho exports to the United States, particularly of clothing, are allowed to come into the U.S. duty-free. So Lesotho's exports are quite large relative to the size of its country when it comes to clothing. Lesotho also has some diamonds that the Americans have purchased. Meanwhile, Lesotho is quite a poor country. So on the one hand, Lesotho is exporting, I think, something on the order of $150 million worth of exports, but it's only buying $3 million worth of goods from the United States. And since the method the U.S. is using is to adjust the tariff rate to the point where they believe it will then result in balanced trade, you can imagine with such a huge surplus, you have to raise the relative price of Lesotho goods to a high degree in order to achieve that balance. So it's complicated, but the bottom line is Lesotho is highly dependent on the United States because of those benefits. It has depended on them so much that if the United States does impose these tariffs, in effect, Lesotho isn't going to be able to sell clothing to the United States. It's going to lose that market, and this is going to have a very adverse effect on that poor country.
So my last question, how should a country like South Africa, which is in the spotlight with President Trump, with the tariffs as well as other issues, how do you think South Africa should respond to this volatile and very difficult situation?
Well, it's an unfair situation, and there will naturally be a tendency to want to retaliate, to try to get even. But the truth is that South Africa is a rather small country relative to the United States. And there's an old saying in trade economics that you shouldn't throw, just because others have rocky shores, you shouldn't throw stones in your harbor. Basically, Just because the United States has raised its tariffs against South Africa, South Africa shouldn't add insult to injury by raising its tariffs and therefore causing more damage in the form of less efficient production in South Africa and more expensive consumption. So my advice to South Africa would not be to respond, but to rather think about the fact that the United States only accounts for about 13% of world trade. There's a big global market out there for 87% of the volume of world trade, and South Africa should try to enhance its international diversification and its international competitiveness rather than trying to fight a war in which the balance rests with the United States. I also think it doesn't serve South Africa's interest to anger the United States and to stand out. Instead, it should be patient, because the kind of damage that these tariffs are going to do to the United States have a fair chance in the long run of actually leading to political pressures on President Trump to reduce them. In addition, he's also trying to use these tariffs for negotiating leverage, and South Africa should wait until those negotiations have had a time to come to fruition.
Great. Well, Professor Lawrence, thank you very much for your time. This has been a fascinating discussion, and thank you for coming to South Africa.
Thanks for inviting me.